Imagine for a moment that you're working in the most sacred place in your life, where every corner holds precious memories of the person you loved most in the world. Now imagine that your boss orders you to serve spoiled food to a humble customer, and when you refuse, he doesn't just fire you. He publicly humiliates you, destroying your reputation and tearing you away from the only place where you could still feel the presence of your dead mother. This is exactly the true story of Sarah Chen, a 25-year-old waitress who lost everything in a single day for doing the right thing. But here's what makes this story absolutely extraordinary. 5 years after this devastating humiliation, Sarah returned to the same restaurant. Only this time she wasn't asking for a job. She was holding a check to buy the entire place. Sarah Chen never imagined her life would be changed forever by a piece of rotten chicken. She worked at Rosie's Diner not only as a waitress, but as a keeper of the memories of her mother, Linda Chen, who had spent 15 years serving the same community with love and dedication until she died of cancer at age 42. When Frank Morrison, the greedy owner, ordered her to serve expired food to a lowly worker, Sarah refused and was publicly humiliated and fired. What Frank didn't know was that by destroying Sarah, he had sown the seeds of his own downfall. In the next few minutes, you'll discover how Sarah turned tears into determination, secret recipes into a multi-million-dollar empire, and how she orchestrated the most elegant and satisfying revenge you've ever witnessed. This is a story about integrity versus greed, and why we should never underestimate a person with true values. The bell on the door of Rosie's Diner had been ringing the same tune for 37 years, and every time Sarah Chen heard that sound, she could almost see her mother's smile. Sarah had worked at this diner on the corner of downtown Millfield for 3 years, but her connection to this place ran deeper than any paycheck could measure. It was here that her mother, Linda Chen, spent 15 years of her life serving coffee and kindness to truck drivers, construction workers, and anyone else in need of a hot meal and a friendly face. Sarah could still picture her mother behind that counter, her dark hair always pulled back in a neat ponytail, her small hands moving with practiced grace as she balanced 4 plates on one arm. Linda was only 19 when she started working here, a young immigrant with broken English and unwavering determination. She saved every tip, learned every regular's name, and somehow managed to make the greasiest burger taste like love. The red vinyl stools had witnessed Linda's evolution from a nervous girl to the backbone of Rosie's, and now they watched their daughter continue that legacy. The restaurant itself was a time capsule from 1987, checkered linoleum floors that had seen better days, fluorescent light fixtures that flickered occasionally, and a jukebox in the corner that still played the same old 80s tunes. But to Sarah, every scratch on the table, every scorch mark on the counter, every faded photo on the wall told a story. There was the photo of her mother holding the Employee of the Month award for 12 consecutive months, the paint mark in the corner where Sarah had drawn as a child, and booth number 7, where her mother used to let her do homework while waiting for her shift to end. Working at Rosie's wasn't just a job for Sarah, it was like living inside her mother's memories. Each morning she tied on the same plaid apron Linda wore, followed the same routes between tables, and served coffee from the same silver coffee pot her mother had mastered. Longtime customers still told stories about Linda, how she memorized everyone's orders, how she always had an encouraging word for anyone struggling, and how she made the best pancakes in town using a secret recipe she never revealed to anyone, except Sarah. The connection was so strong that sometimes Sarah felt like her mother was still there, whispering instructions in her ear about how to fold the napkins perfectly, or reminding her to always ask if the customer wanted more coffee. The restaurant had become a sanctuary, where Linda's memories remained vivid, where every smile Sarah offered was an echo of the affection her mother had spread across these same tables for years. It was the only place in the world where Sarah could still feel the presence of the woman who had raised her alone, working double shifts to ensure her daughter had a better future. But not everyone understood the sentimental value the place held. To Frank Morrison, the restaurant's owner, Rosie's was just a business, numbers on a spreadsheet, profit margins, and nothing more. He had bought the establishment 2 years after Linda's death, promising to maintain the tradition and family values that made Rosie's special. But Sarah would soon discover that Frank's promises were as empty as the milk jugs he insisted on using, even when they were going sour, and that his definition of values had more to do with saving money than honoring the memory of those who had built the place's reputation. Linda Chen died on a rainy Tuesday in October, 3 days after her 42nd birthday. Pancreatic cancer had struck cruelly and swiftly, giving the family only 4 months to say goodbye. Sarah remembered every detail of those final days. The smell of disinfectant in the hospital, her mother's cold hands holding hers, and the last words Linda whispered in a weak but determined voice. "Promise me you'll be strong, my daughter. And always remember that the love we put into food feeds more than just our stomachs. It feeds our souls." In the months following Linda's death, Sarah found herself lost in a world that had suddenly lost all color. She was only 22, had just graduated from community college with a degree in business administration, and had no idea how to move forward without the woman who had been her anchor, her best friend, and her inspiration. The house they shared felt eerily quiet, without the clang of Linda's pots and pans, testing new recipes in the kitchen, without her laughter watching Brazilian soap operas on TV, and without her stories about the restaurant customers she treated like family. It was during these dark days that Sarah decided to accept the job offer at Rosie's Diner. Frank Morrison had called a week after the funeral, his voice feigning compassion that didn't reach his eyes, offering a waitressing position in honor of Linda's memory. At the time, Sarah thought it was a kindness. Years later, she would understand that Frank simply needed someone who knew the regulars and could keep the operation running without expensive training. But in that moment of deep grief, the offer felt like a lifeline in an ocean of grief. The first day of work was simultaneously emotionally devastating and comforting. Sarah tied on her mother's apron. Frank had allowed her to keep it as a special courtesy, and felt as if she were wearing Linda's memories. Regular customers greeted her with tear-stained smiles, telling stories of how her mother had impacted their lives, how she always remembered their grandchildren's birthdays, how she secretly paid for meals for those struggling financially, and how she transformed the simple act of serving coffee into a gesture of genuine caring. Working at Rosie's became Sarah's therapy, the only place where she could still feel her mother's presence. She discovered handwritten recipes hidden in the kitchen drawer, Linda's familiar handwriting, documenting culinary secrets she had developed over the years. There was the recipe for the special pancakes. The secret was a hint of vanilla and love, the perfect salad dressing mix, balsamic vinegar, honey, and Dijon mustard, and even detailed instructions on how to make each customer feel at home, with notes like, "Mr. Martinez likes his coffee extra strong and always asks about his grandson," and "Miss Helen prefers the table by the window and enjoys talking about gardening." With each passing day, Sarah felt she was not just working, but preserving a legacy. She memorized every story customers told about Linda, practiced the recipes, until she could replicate the exact flavor her mother used to create, and gradually took on the role Linda had played, the person who transformed a simple meal into a moment of human connection. The restaurant had become more than a workplace. It was a living museum of her mother's memories, a place where the love Linda had planted continued to grow through her daughter's hands. It was a typical Thursday in March when Sarah made the discovery that would change her life forever. She was organizing the kitchen refrigerator during her morning shift when she noticed something that made her stomach churn: 3 trays of chicken that should have been discarded at least 4 days ago. The meat had a suspicious greenish tinge and a sour smell that cut through the air like a knife. Sarah checked the date labels, all clearly expired, some by more than a week. Next to the trays of chicken, she found containers of potato salad with a whitish film on the surface, and jars of dressing that had been separated in a way that made it look like some science experiment had gone wrong. Frank Morrison had implemented a new policy in recent weeks. Nothing was to be thrown away without his personal approval. He claimed it was a measure to reduce waste and maximize operational efficiency, but Sarah suspected it was just greed disguised as responsible management. Frank had bought the restaurant for a steal 2 years earlier, promising to maintain the quality and standards Linda had established, but with each passing month, it became clearer that his priorities were profit margins, not customer satisfaction or the integrity of the food. Sarah had tried to approach Frank about the expired ingredients the week before, but he had simply shrugged and said that an expiration date is just a suggestion and that people in our generation are very paranoid about food. He had laughed off her concern, saying that his parents ate leftovers for days without issue and that a little bacteria is good for the immune system. Frank's casual attitude toward food safety made Sarah feel like she was betraying everything her mother had taught her about caring for people through food. Things reached a boiling point when Sarah saw the cook, Tony, reluctantly starting to make chicken sandwiches with expired meat. Tony was a good man. He'd worked with Linda for years and deeply respected her memory, but he also had 3 children to feed and couldn't afford to lose his job. When Sarah asked why he was using clearly spoiled ingredients, Tony just shook his head and whispered, "Frank said if I don't use this, he'll fire me. He said most people won't even notice the difference, and if anyone complains, we can always just say it was an allergic reaction or something." The smell of rotten meat grilling filled the kitchen with a nauseating aroma Sarah knew her mother would never have tolerated. Linda used to say that a restaurant kitchen was like the heart of a home. If the heart was sick, everything else died with it. Sarah looked at the photo of her mother on the kitchen wall, the one where Linda proudly held the Certificate of Excellence in Food Safety. She had earned 3 years in a row and felt a mixture of anger and determination rising in her chest. She knew she was about to face a choice that would define not only her future at the restaurant, but who she truly was as a person. Frank appeared in the kitchen doorway at that moment, checking the progress of the orders with the haste of someone who sees only numbers, not people. He clapped his hands and shouted, "Come on, everyone, we have a line of customers waiting and time is money." Sarah looked at him, then at the spoiled meat on the grill, then back at the photo of her mother, and knew the moment of truth had arrived. She had no idea that the decision she was about to make in the next few minutes would destroy her connection to the only place in the world where she could still feel her mother's presence, but would also set her on a path that would eventually bring her back, not as an employee but as an owner. The man who sat in booth number 3 had the kind of tired look in his eyes that comes from working too hard for too little. His name was Miguel Santos, a 50-something construction worker who had been coming to Rosie's for about 6 months. Sarah knew he always ordered the same thing: a grilled chicken sandwich, fries, and a black coffee. He always counted his coins carefully before ordering, organized the crumpled bills with the precision of someone who knows the exact value of every penny, and always left a $2 tip. Not much, but Sarah knew it represented a genuine sacrifice for him. Miguel had arrived in the United States 5 years earlier, leaving behind family in Mexico with the promise of sending them money once he was settled. He worked construction sites from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., taking 2 buses to get home, and Rosie's was his one weekly extravagance, a moment where he could sit in peace, eat a hot meal, and pretend for half an hour that he wasn't completely alone in a foreign country. Sarah had noticed that he always carried a worn family photo in his shirt pocket, and sometimes she'd catch him looking at it while he ate, with an expression that mixed longing and determination. On that fateful Thursday, Miguel had arrived earlier than usual, likely because he'd been let out of work early due to the rain. He sat at his favorite table, greeted Sarah with the shy smile she'd come to appreciate, and placed his usual order. "Grilled chicken sandwich, please, Señorita Sarah. And, if possible, a little extra salsa. Today was a rough day." He laughed in a way that tried to hide his sadness, and Sarah felt that familiar pang in her heart she always felt when she saw good people struggling. Sarah took the order and walked to the kitchen, where she found Tony hesitating with the spatula in his hand, staring at the rotting meat on the griddle. The nauseating smell had intensified with the heat, creating a toxic atmosphere that made his eyes sting. Frank stood beside him, overseeing the operation with the satisfaction of someone who believes he's being clever in gaming the system. "Come on, Tony, it's no big deal. Add a little more seasoning and no one will notice." That's the reality of the business. Sometimes you have to get creative with the ingredients. It was at that moment that Sarah understood the true gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about serving spoiled food. This was about serving spoiled food to Miguel, a man who worked under the scorching sun for 12 hours a day, who counted every penny to afford a decent meal, who trusted Rosie's to provide him with something safe and nutritious in a life already full of uncertainty. The idea that this good, hard-working man could become ill or worse because of Frank's greed caused something inside Sarah to break irreparably. Sarah thought of her mother at that moment, of the stories Linda used to tell about the customers who didn't have much money but whom she always treated like royalty. Linda had raised Sarah with the philosophy that serving food was a sacred act. You were literally sustaining another person's life, nourishing not only their body but also their soul. "When someone sits at our table," Linda would say, They are placing their trust in our hands. That trust is more valuable than any money they could ever pay us." Sarah glanced at Miguel through the kitchen window once more, saw him staring at the family photo while waiting for his meal, and made the decision that would change her life forever. She could not, and would not, allow this honest man to be poisoned by Frank Morrison's greed. No matter what it cost her personally, no matter if she lost her job, no matter if she lost her connection to her mother's memories. There were certain lines that simply could not be crossed, and serving spoiled food to vulnerable people was definitely one of them. Sarah took the spatula from Tony's hand and turned off the grill with a firm, definitive movement. The silence that followed in the kitchen was broken only by the hiss of cooling metal and the distant sound of conversations in the dining room. Tony looked at her with a mixture of relief and terror, knowing Sarah had just done something he didn't have the courage to do, but also knowing the consequences would be severe. Frank Morrison wasn't known for accepting challenges to his authority, especially from employees he considered easily replaceable. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Frank's voice cut through the air like a blade, filled with a rage that made everyone in the kitchen freeze. He had noticed the interruption of his observation post and marched into the kitchen, his face flushed with indignation. Frank was a short, stocky man, but he made up for his lack of physical presence with a vocal aggression that had intimidated staff for years, his small, calculating eyes fixed on Sarah with the intensity of a predator who had just spotted prey. "I won't serve spoiled food to Miguel or anyone else," Sarah replied, her voice surprisingly firm despite her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. She clutched her mother's apron like a talisman, feeling the strength of Linda's convictions flowing through the worn fabric. "That meat's been expired for a week, Frank. If anyone eats it, they could get seriously ill, and I know my mother would never allow that." Frank let out a bitter, cruel laugh that echoed through the kitchen like the bark of a rabid dog. "Your mother? Your mother was dead and buried when I bought this place, honey, and you're nothing more than a waitress who can be replaced in 2 hours. You think because your mother worked here you have some special right? Well, I have news for you. This is my restaurant now, and things run my way." The cruelty in Frank's words was calculated, designed to hurt Sarah where she was most vulnerable. The disrespectful mention of her mother set something inside Sarah ablaze, but she maintained her composure with an inner strength she hadn't even known she possessed. "You may own the building, Frank, but you don't own my integrity. And I'm not going to poison people to increase your profits. If that means you fire me, then so be it. But I'm not participating in that." She crossed her arms and planted herself firmly on the ground, a human barrier between the spoiled food and the innocent customer waiting outside. Frank was silent for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he calculated his next move. Sarah could see the gears turning in his head. He knew she was right about the food. He knew serving expired ingredients was illegal and dangerous, but his wounded pride and greed trumped any concerns about safety or morality. "You know what, Sarah Chen?" he finally said, his voice low and dangerous. "You're right about one thing. You will be fired, but it won't be in private, no. You want to play the hero? Then let's see how you feel about being humiliated in front of everyone." Frank turned and marched toward the dining room, leaving Sarah with the terrible realization that her decision to protect Miguel was about to cost her much more than just her job. She looked once more at her mother's photo on the wall, at the apron that held so many memories, and at the kitchen that had been her sanctuary for 3 years. In a few minutes, all of this would be history, and she would be back in the cold, lonely world she had known after Linda's death. But even knowing what was coming, Sarah felt not a shred of regret. Some battles are worth fighting, even when you know you'll lose. Frank Morrison stormed out of the kitchen, his breathing heavy and his fists clenched, betraying a rage that had surpassed all bounds of professional decency. The Rosie's dining room was moderately full for a Thursday lunchtime. Miguel in booth 3, a retired couple at the corner table, 3 office workers chatting about a project, and a few regulars at the counter sipping coffee. The atmosphere was relaxed and familiar, the soft hum of conversation mingling with the sound of the radio playing oldies. No one was prepared for the spectacle that was about to unfold. "Attention, everyone!" Frank shouted, slamming his hand on the counter hard enough to make coffee cups bounce on their saucers. The entire room instantly fell silent. All conversations stopped, and all eyes turned to him with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. Frank had a cruel smile on his face, the kind of expression people wear when they're about to destroy someone, and enjoying it. "I'd like you all to meet Sarah Chen here, Linda's daughter, who worked at this establishment for 3 years." Sarah emerged slowly from the kitchen, still holding her mother's apron, her eyes scanning the room and meeting Miguel's confused gaze. She could see the concern growing on his face, the way he leaned forward slightly as if trying to protect her somehow. The other customers seemed equally disconcerted, clearly sensing the tension in the air, but not understanding what was happening. Sarah felt as if she were walking to her own public funeral, but she held her head high with the dignity her mother had taught her. "Sarah here just informed me that she will no longer be working for me," Frank continued, his voice rising in volume and intensity, "because apparently she knows better than I do how to run my own restaurant. She thinks she can tell me what food to serve, what decisions to make, and how to run my business." He paused dramatically, letting his words echo through the quiet room. "Well, I have news for Miss Sarah. No one tells me how to run my property." The discomfort in the room was palpable now. Miguel had risen from his table, his fists clenched, clearly wanting to intervene but unsure how. The retired couple exchanged worried glances, and the office workers had stopped eating completely, absorbed in the drama unfolding before them. Sarah could sense sympathy radiating from some people, but she also noticed some customers who simply wanted to get out of the uncomfortable situation as quickly as possible. "So here's what's going to happen," Frank declared, pointing an accusing finger at Sarah. "Miss Sarah Chen is officially fired, effective immediately. And you know why? Because she has no loyalty, no gratitude, and no respect for her superiors. I gave her a job when no one else would. I kept this place running after her mother died, and this is how she thanks me, by trying to sabotage me in front of the customers." Frank's words echoed through the room like slaps, each syllable calculated for maximum humiliation. Sarah felt tears burning in her eyes, not because of the dismissal, she knew it was coming, but because of the cruel and public way it was being executed. Frank was deliberately destroying her reputation in front of people she had served and known for years, people who had known and loved her mother. It was a kind of cruelty that went beyond simple professional brutality. It was personal, poisonous, and designed to ensure Sarah would never forget this moment. "Grab your things and leave," Frank growled, his voice low but thick with venom. "And don't come back. This establishment is no longer welcome to you." He turned to the customers, forcing a fake smile that didn't even reach his eyes. "I'm sorry you had to witness this, folks. Sometimes you find out people aren't who you thought they were, but don't worry. We'll be back to normal in a few minutes." Sarah untied her mother's apron with trembling fingers, knowing she was losing much more than a job. She was losing her last tangible connection to the woman who had been everything to her. Sarah walked toward the exit of Rosie's on legs, shaking like jelly, carrying only a small bag containing her personal belongings and her mother's apron folded neatly in her arms. Each step toward the door echoed painfully in the silent dining room, where the customers watched in utter shock at what she had just witnessed. Miguel had risen completely from the table and taken a step toward her, his eyes filled with righteous anger and profound sadness, as if he understood perfectly that he had lost not just a waitress, but one of the few genuinely good people he had ever met in his life in the United States. The doorbell rang for the last time as Sarah left, the sound that had once symbolized home and happy memories, now resounding like a funeral. Outside, the March afternoon was cold and overcast, with the kind of biting wind that seems to know exactly where to find exposed skin to cause maximum discomfort. Sarah leaned against the brick wall of the restaurant for a moment, her legs finally giving way under the emotional weight of what had just happened. She clutched her mother's apron to her chest and finally allowed the tears to fall freely. These weren't just tears for the dismissal or the public humiliation. They were tears for everything she had lost all at once. The restaurant wasn't just her workplace. It was the last place in the world where she could still feel her mother's presence, where Linda's memories remained vivid and tangible. It was where Sarah had learned her mother's secret recipes, where she had heard countless stories of the kindness Linda spread daily, where she had felt connected to something bigger than herself. Now all of that had been ripped away from her in a matter of minutes, and she was back in the painful reality of a world without Linda Chen. Sarah thought of all the mornings she'd woken excited to go to work, not for the modest salary that barely covered her expenses, but for the opportunity to honor her mother's memory by serving the same people Linda had cared for. She thought of the Sundays she'd spent at the restaurant on her day off, cleaning and organizing without pay, simply because she wanted the place to remain worthy of her mother's legacy. She thought of the nights she'd stayed up late practicing Linda's recipes, determined to keep alive the flavors that had brought so much joy to so many. The cruel irony of the situation was not lost on Sarah. She had been fired for doing exactly what her mother would have done. Linda Chen would never in a million years have served spoiled food to anyone, especially someone like Miguel, who worked hard and deserved respect and care. Linda had raised Sarah with unwavering values about treating all people with dignity, regardless of how much money they had or their social status. And now those same values, the core of her identity, had cost Sarah her connection to the only thing left of her mother. As she stood there on the sidewalk, watching through the restaurant's fogged-up window, Sarah saw Frank resume his activities as if nothing had happened, serving customers with a fake smile while probably planning how to explain the situation in a way that would make him look like the victim. She saw Miguel still standing at his booth, clearly agitated and looking toward the door as if considering leaving as well. And she saw Tony in the kitchen, probably being forced to make the chicken sandwich with the expired meat, his conscience weighing down on him like a stone. In that moment of absolute grief, sitting on the cold sidewalk with her mother's apron as her only truly valuable possession, Sarah had no idea she was at the beginning of a journey that would lead her back to Rosie's, not as a humiliated employee, but as the triumphant owner. She didn't know that the pain she felt in that moment would fuel a determination that would drive her to build something extraordinary. All she knew was that she had lost everything that mattered, and that the world suddenly felt very cold and very empty without the warmth of her mother's memories to warm her. 3 weeks after the humiliation at Rosie's, Sarah sat in her small one-bedroom apartment, surrounded by stacks of rejected resumes and rejection letters. Frank Morrison had been so effective in spreading his distorted version of events that no restaurant in Millfield would hire her. The stories varied depending on the teller, but they all painted Sarah as a problematic, disrespectful, and unreliable employee. The small community of restaurateurs communicated among themselves, and her name had become synonymous with trouble. Sarah's financial situation was deteriorating rapidly. Her already meager savings were disappearing with rent, utilities, and basic necessities like food. She had applied for jobs at supermarkets, department stores, and even call centers. But with no positive references from her most recent job, she was facing rejection after rejection. The irony was cruel. She was going hungry because she refused to let others get sick from spoiled food. It was during one of these dark nights that Sarah found a dusty cardboard box in the back of the closet, a relic of her mother's belongings that she had never had the courage to open fully. Inside the box, along with old photos and letters, she discovered a handwritten recipe book in Linda's familiar handwriting. But these weren't just recipes, they were detailed business plans, dreams Linda had written about opening her own restaurant someday. Page after page of ideas about how to create a place that was more than just food, but a true community, where people could feel loved and cared for. One recipe in particular caught Sarah's eye. Mama Chen's secret sauce, the taste of home. It was a complex blend of Asian and American ingredients that Linda had developed over the years, a fusion that reflected her own journey as an immigrant. Alongside the recipe, Linda had written a note. This sauce tells our story, where we come from, where we are, and how love can blend anything and make it delicious. One day Sarah will understand that food is our universal love language. Sarah prepared the sauce that very night, following her mother's instructions with reverent precision. The aroma that filled her small apartment was like a hug from the past, familiar, comforting, and laden with memories of Linda experimenting and perfecting the recipe in her kitchen at home. When Sarah tasted the final result, she knew immediately there was something special here. The flavor was unique, complex, and completely addictive, a perfect combination of sweet, salty, spicy, and umami that danced on the palate in a way she had never experienced before. The next morning, Sarah made a decision that would change her life forever. She used her last $30 to buy ingredients and prepared several batches of her mother's sauce in recycled glass jars. Then she took a bus to downtown Millfield and positioned herself near the farmers' market, where office workers often ate lunch, with a cardboard sign that read, "Mama Chen's homemade sauce, try it free." She began offering small samples to anyone willing to try it. The reaction was immediate and electrifying. The first person to try the sauce, a middle-aged executive eating a bland sandwich, stopped mid-chew, her eyes widened, and she asked where she could buy a whole bottle. Within 2 hours, Sarah had sold every jar she'd brought and had a list of 15 people wanting to place orders. For the first time since her layoff, she felt something she'd forgotten what it felt like: hope. Her mother's legacy hadn't died with Linda. It lived on in the recipes, the stories, and the love that had been passed down through generations. The success of her first day selling her mother's sauce was just the beginning. Sarah quickly realized she had stumbled upon something much bigger than a simple recipe. She had discovered a pent-up demand for authentic food, made with love, and that told a real story. People weren't just buying sauce, they were buying an emotional connection, an experience that reminded them of home, family, and simpler times. Within a week, Sarah was receiving orders from people who hadn't even tried the product, but who had heard from friends about that Asian girl with the amazing sauce that makes you feel like your grandma is cooking for you. Sarah decided to expand beyond the original sauce, delving deeper into her mother's recipe book. She discovered instructions for making homemade dumplings, a special chicken seasoning Linda had created by blending Korean spices with American herbs, and a meat marinade that transformed even the cheapest cuts into succulent delicacies. Each recipe came with a short story written in Linda's handwriting, memories of her childhood in Korea, adaptations she made for American ingredients, and lessons she had learned serving working-class families at Rosie's. Sarah's operation grew organically from her kitchen into a small catering operation she called Mama Chen's Kitchen, a direct homage to the woman who had inspired it all. She began preparing full meals for small corporate events, using her mother's recipes as a foundation, but adding her own creativity and passion to the process. Her specialty became what she called comfort food fusion, dishes that combined Asian culinary tradition with the honesty of American diner food, creating something entirely new yet deeply familiar. The turning point came when Sarah was hired to cook for a birthday party for the CEO of a local tech company. Rebecca Martinez was an executive known for her discerning palate and connections across the business sector. Sarah prepared a full menu based on her mother's recipes: pork dumplings with homemade soy sauce, marinated chicken served with coconut rice, and her secret sauce paired with a variety of grilled vegetables. The response was so positive that Rebecca immediately offered to hire Sarah to cook for her company's corporate events every week. Most importantly, Rebecca became an informal mentor to Sarah, teaching her about business planning, marketing, and financial management. "You have something special here," Rebecca said during one of their conversations, "but you need to think bigger. This isn't just a catering business. It's a brand, an experience, a story that people want to be a part of." Rebecca helped Sarah understand that she wasn't just selling food, she was selling nostalgia, authenticity, and an emotional connection that big food corporations could never replicate. With Rebecca's guidance, Sarah began developing a more ambitious business plan. She officially registered Mama Chen's Kitchen as an LLC, developed a visual identity that honored her Asian American heritage, and began documenting every recipe and process to ensure consistency as she grew. Most crucially, she began saving every penny she earned, not for personal expenses, but for a very specific goal that had been born on that terrible day at Rosie's. Sarah had realized that her true mission wasn't just to build a successful business. It was to prove that integrity, quality, and genuine love for people could still win in a world where men like Frank Morrison thought they could profit from degradation and dishonesty. 2 years after that first sauce sale at the farmer's market, Sarah had grown Mama Chen's Kitchen into an operation processing over 150 orders per week. What began in her home kitchen now operated out of a rented commercial kitchen in the Millfield Industrial District, with 3 full-time employees and a months-long waiting list. Sarah had discovered that her unique combination of traditional recipes and operational excellence created a culinary experience that customers couldn't find anywhere else. The reputation of Mama Chen's Kitchen had spread far beyond Millfield's borders. Food bloggers from neighboring towns made special trips to try Sarah's famous dumplings, and her secret marinade had become such a sought-after item that she began selling it in sealed bottles to regional distributors. Her mother's original sauce was now on the shelves of 12 supermarkets across 3 counties, and Sarah had developed an entire line of complementary products, seasonings, marinades, and even a vegan version of the secret sauce that had won over a whole new segment of customers. But Sarah wasn't just building a business, she was creating a movement. Every Mama Chen's Kitchen product came with the story behind the recipe, connecting customers not just to the flavor, but to the emotional journey of an immigrant family who had transformed love into food and food into legacy. Sarah had learned that people were hungry for authenticity in an increasingly corporate and depersonalized world, and she had found a way to feed that hunger, both literally and metaphorically. The financial success was surprising even to Sarah. Within 3 years, Mama Chen's Kitchen was generating $1.2 million in annual revenue, with profit margins that would make any business consultant proud. Sarah had reinvested most of the profits back into the business, expanding production capacity, improving processes, and developing new products. But she had also begun to save a substantial amount for a very specific project, one she kept a top secret, shared only with Rebecca, who had become her most trusted partner and advisor. Rebecca had helped Sarah understand the power of capital and strategic timing. "You're not just building a food company," Rebecca explained during one of their monthly planning meetings. "You're positioning for a much bigger play. When the time is right, you'll have the resources and credibility to do anything you want." Rebecca had seen many entrepreneurs build successful businesses, but rarely had she seen someone with Sarah's unique combination of culinary talent, moral integrity, and a hunger for justice that went far beyond personal profit. At the end of her 3rd year, Sarah made a discovery that would change everything. Through her contacts in the local food industry, she learned that Frank Morrison was facing serious financial difficulties at Rosie's Diner. The restaurant's reputation had deteriorated dramatically after his departure. Regulars had stopped coming, competent employees had resigned, and rumors about questionable food quality had spread throughout the community. Frank had tried to further cut costs to maintain profitability, but this only accelerated the downward spiral. The man who had publicly humiliated Sarah was now desperately trying to sell the restaurant that had once been the Chen family's pride and joy. Sarah was silent for a long moment when she heard the news, clutching her mother's apron, which she still treasured. After 5 years of hard work, sacrifice, and meticulous construction, the opportunity she had secretly dreamed of had finally arrived. The circle was about to close, but this time Sarah Chen wouldn't be the humiliated waitress begging for a job. She would be the buyer with money in the bank, credibility in the market, and the power to choose exactly how the story would end. It was a Thursday in March, exactly 5 years after her public humiliation, when Sarah Chen parked her black Mercedes-Benz in front of Rosie's Diner. She had deliberately chosen the same day of the week, almost the same time, and even wore an apron. Not her mother's, which remained carefully kept at home like a sacred relic, but a new apron embroidered with the Mama Chen's Kitchen logo. The difference was that this time, she wasn't arriving as an employee desperate for work, but as a successful entrepreneur with a blank check in her pocket and a 5-year plan in the works. The restaurant Sarah found was unrecognizably dilapidated. The paint on the facade was peeling, several of the neon signs had burned out and hadn't been replaced, and through the dusty windows she could see that half the tables were empty, even during lunch hours. The parking lot, once packed with cars of workers and families, now held only 3 vehicles, including Frank Morrison's rusted pickup truck, who was clearly experiencing personal financial difficulties on top of the restaurant's problems. Sarah took a deep breath, adjusted the designer blazer she'd bought especially for this occasion, and pushed open the familiar door. The bell rang the same nostalgic melody, but the sound now echoed in a space that felt ghostly compared to the vibrant memories she held. The smell was different too, no longer the inviting aroma of home-cooked food and fresh coffee, but something closer to mold, old oil, and hopelessness. Only 6 customers were scattered throughout the room, most of them seeming more interested in finishing their meals quickly and leaving than in savoring the experience. Frank Morrison stood behind the counter, visibly older and more tired than Sarah remembered. His hair had grayed considerably, he had gained weight in a way that suggested stress and poor nutrition, and his clothes were wrinkled as if he'd slept in them. When his eyes met Sarah's, she saw a rapid sequence of emotions flit across his face. Initial confusion, gradual recognition, and then a complex mix of shock, embarrassment, and something that might have been fear. "Sarah?" Frank murmured, his voice uncertain as if he were seeing a ghost. "Sarah Chen, what are you doing here?" He glanced nervously at the other customers, clearly remembering the scene he'd caused 5 years earlier, and probably wondering if she'd returned for some kind of public confrontation. His hands shook slightly as he tried to wipe the counter with a dirty cloth, a nervous gesture that revealed how shaken he was by the unexpected appearance of the woman he'd so cruelly dismissed. Sarah approached the counter with the calm confidence of someone who had spent 5 years preparing for this very moment. She placed a sleek leather briefcase on the stained surface and looked Frank directly in the eye with a serenity that contrasted dramatically with the last time they had seen each other. "Hi, Frank," she said, her voice soft but carrying an authority that had been absent 5 years earlier. "I came to talk business. I heard you're trying to sell the restaurant." The silence that followed was deafening. Frank opened and closed his mouth repeatedly like a fish out of water, clearly struggling to process the impossible transformation from humiliated waitress to obviously prosperous businesswoman. The other customers had stopped eating and were discreetly observing the interaction, sensing the electric tension in the air without fully understanding its origin. Sarah remained perfectly calm, savoring every second of the complete role reversal that had taken half a decade to orchestrate. Frank Morrison swallowed, his eyes roving Sarah from head to toe as if trying to reconcile the image of the waitress he'd fired with the businesswoman standing before him. The Mercedes parked outside, the clearly expensive blazer, the Italian leather briefcase, and most of all, the absolute confidence radiating from Sarah. All of it painted a picture his mind struggled to accept. You want to buy the restaurant?" he stammered, his voice breaking slightly on the last word. Sarah opened her folder and pulled out a sleek business card, placing it on the counter between them. "Mama Chen's Kitchen, Sarah Chen, CEO and founder," Frank read aloud, his voice growing fainter with each word. Below the company name was a small line that made the blood drain from his face. "Specializing in authenticity, integrity, and culinary excellence." Sarah had chosen these words very deliberately, each one a subtle stab at the values Frank had abandoned in the name of easy profit. "You probably don't follow the artisanal food market much," Sarah said, her voice professional but with an undercurrent of satisfaction that only Frank could detect. "But Mama Chen's Kitchen has become one of the fastest-growing regional food brands in the state. Our products are in over 50 stores, we process thousands of orders a month, and our annual revenue just surpassed $2 million. She paused, letting the numbers sink in. "So yes, Frank, I have both the interest and the resources to purchase this establishment." The other diners in the restaurant had abandoned any pretense of not listening and were openly watching the drama unfold. An elderly woman in the corner booth whispered to her husband, "Isn't that the girl he fired a few years ago?" A man at the counter had stopped stirring his coffee and was watching with the fascination of someone witnessing a car accident in slow motion. The atmosphere in the restaurant had completely changed, from a depressing, lifeless place to the scene of an epic revenge plot unfolding in real time. Frank tried to regain some control of the situation, squaring his shoulders and trying to project an authority he clearly no longer felt. "Well, the restaurant isn't officially on the market yet. I was just exploring options, you know. This place has a lot of sentimental value, a lot of history." His words sounded hollow even to himself, and Sarah could see the desperation growing in his eyes. She knew from her sources in the local business community that Frank was facing 3 months of rent arrears and that the building's landlord had threatened eviction if he didn't get his act together quickly. Sarah opened the folder again and pulled out a single sheet of paper, a pre-approval letter from a reputable bank showing she had immediate access to sufficient funds to purchase the restaurant twice over. She placed the document on the counter and watched Frank read the numbers, seeing his expression change from skepticism to utter shock. "Like I said, Frank, I came here to talk business. I'm prepared to make a cash offer, closing in 2 weeks, no financing strings attached." She leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering to a pitch only Frank could hear. "The only question is whether you're prepared to sell to the problematic waitress you publicly humiliated 5 years ago." The closing meeting took place the following Friday at Sarah's lawyer's office, an elegant room overlooking downtown Millfield that contrasted sharply with the dilapidated surroundings of Rosie's. Frank arrived 20 minutes late, driving his rusty pickup truck and wearing the only suit that still fit, clearly uncomfortable in the formal setting. Sarah was already there, sitting calmly next to Rebecca and her lawyer, with a stack of documents organized with military precision. The final price was exactly what Sarah had offered, $280,000 cash, a sum Frank couldn't refuse given his desperate financial situation. The price was fair for the property, but they both knew the true cost to Frank went far beyond money. He was selling not just a restaurant, but his dignity to the woman he had tried to destroy 5 years earlier. Each signature on the documents felt like a public confession that his arrogance and greed had been completely defeated by integrity and hard work. Sarah watched Frank sign the papers with trembling hands, remembering the last time they had seen each other. Then he had been the powerful man humiliating a vulnerable waitress. Now she was the successful businesswoman buying his failing business. The poetic justice of the situation was not lost on anyone present. When Frank handed over the keys, his hands shook so badly that they fell to the table with a metallic clink that echoed in the quiet room. "There's one final condition," Sarah said when the paperwork was nearly complete. "I want you to continue working at the restaurant for 6 months as assistant manager to ease the transition." Frank looked at her with a mixture of shock and despair, clearly realizing that Sarah was offering him exactly what he'd done to her, a subordinate position where he would rely on the kindness of his former subordinate. "The salary will be fair," she continued, "and you can look for other employment during that time. But I need someone familiar with the suppliers and current processes." The irony of the situation was so perfect, it was almost poetic. Frank Morrison, who had fired Sarah for trying to protect a customer from spoiled food, would now be employed by the woman he had humiliated. He, who had said she was easily replaceable, now discovered that he himself was completely expendable. The tables had completely turned, and everyone in the room could feel the historic weight of the moment. Frank nodded weakly, his voice barely audible as he murmured, "I accept the terms." Sarah extended her hand for a professional handshake, and when Frank shook it, she felt as if she were closing not just a business transaction, but a full circle of justice. In 6 months, she would officially own the place where her mother had worked so proudly, where her own most precious memories were kept, and where she could finally honor Linda Chen's legacy in the way she had always dreamed. Frank's first day as Sarah's employee was an exercise in forced humility he would never forget. Sarah arrived at 7 a.m., wearing her mother's apron for the first time in 5 years, and found Frank waiting nervously at the back entrance. "Good morning, Frank," she said with cordial professionalism. "Today we're going to start by thoroughly cleaning the kitchen and reviewing all food safety protocols. I want you to show me exactly how things have been working here." The inspection revealed exactly what Sarah expected: poorly organized refrigerators, expired ingredients hidden behind fresh produce, and a complete absence of the basic standards her mother had religiously maintained. Frank tried to justify each problem, but his explanations rang hollow in the face of clear evidence of negligence. Sarah methodically documented each violation, not to humiliate him, but to establish a new standard of operation based on the integrity she had learned from Linda. "Frank, let's establish a very simple rule," Sarah said, as she discarded 3 trays of expired meat. "In this restaurant, we never, ever, under any circumstances, serve food we wouldn't eat ourselves. There are no exceptions, no shortcuts, no financial justifications. This place's reputation was built on customer trust, and we're going to rebuild that trust one dish at a time." Over the next few weeks, Frank discovered what it meant to work for someone who truly cared about excellence. Sarah implemented quality control systems he had never considered necessary, trained the team in safety protocols he had ignored, and most importantly, established a culture of respect for customers that contrasted dramatically with his previous profit-at-any-cost approach. The most powerful moment came when Miguel Santos returned to the restaurant for the first time in 5 years. Sarah recognized him immediately and greeted him personally, explaining the changes she had implemented and assuring him that he would now always receive the best food possible. Frank watched silently as Sarah served Miguel with the same care and attention his mother had shown, realizing that he had missed not only a business deal, but also a fundamental lesson in human dignity. At the end of the 6 months, Frank approached Sarah with an expression she had never seen before: genuine humility. "Sarah," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "I want to apologize, not just for firing you, but for losing sight of what this place truly meant. Your mother would be proud of what you've done here." Sarah nodded graciously, knowing her victory was complete, not only because she had reclaimed the restaurant, but because she had transformed her former oppressor into someone capable of recognizing his own mistakes. 2 years after its acquisition, Rosie's Diner had transformed into something beyond even Linda Chen's wildest dreams. Sarah had carefully preserved all the nostalgic elements that made the place special: the red vinyl stools, the 1980s jukebox, and the vintage light fixtures, but had elevated the quality of the food and service to a standard that attracted customers from all over the area. Booth number 7, where she used to do her homework, now bore a small gold plaque, Chen Family Table, where memories are served with love. The menu combined the traditional recipes loved by regulars with the innovative creations of Mama Chen's kitchen. Her mother's famous secret sauce was now available at every table, and the homemade dumplings became the house's most sought-after specialty. Sarah had achieved something few restaurateurs can: honor the past while creating something completely new and exceptional. Miguel Santos now ate lunch at the restaurant 3 times a week, always at his favorite table, but this time paying with the confidence of knowing he would be treated with dignity and respect. He had become one of the biggest advocates of the new Rosie's, telling everyone he knew how Sarah had transformed not just the food, but the soul of the place. "That's the difference," he used to say, "between someone who just owns a business and someone who truly cares about people." Sarah kept a framed photo of her mother at the front counter, along with one of her handwritten recipes under glass. Customers often asked about Linda, and Sarah proudly told their stories, keeping alive the memory of the woman who had planted the seeds for everything the restaurant had become. The place had become not just a restaurant, but a living memorial to the values of integrity, hard work, and genuine love for people. On the kitchen wall, Sarah had hung her mother's apron in a special frame, along with a quote that summed up everything she had learned. "The love we put into food feeds more than just the stomach. It feeds the soul." Frank Morrison had been replaced by Tony, who now served as executive chef, ensuring that every dish served lived up to the standards Linda Chen had set decades before. Sarah's journey from humiliated waitress to millionaire businesswoman had come to an end, but her true triumph wasn't in her bank account or business success. It was in the knowledge that she had honored her mother's memory in the only way that truly mattered, by treating each customer with dignity, serving food made with love, and proving that integrity is not only a noble value, but also a winning strategy. Rosie's Diner once again echoed with laughter, warm conversation, and the sound of a community being nourished, just as Linda Chen had always dreamed. Sarah Chen's story teaches us a powerful lesson that resonates far beyond the walls of Rosie's Diner. Integrity isn't just a nice moral value, it's a transformative force that can move mountains and change destinies. When Sarah refused to serve Miguel spoiled food, she wasn't just protecting a customer. She was planting the seeds of her own future success. Every time we choose to do the right thing, even when it costs us dearly, we're investing in a future we can't yet see, but which is being built brick by brick with our daily decisions. Now tell me, have you ever been in a situation where doing the right thing cost you dearly in the moment? Have you ever had a boss or supervisor test your values? How did you react? And most importantly, if you had the opportunity Sarah had to buy the business from someone who humiliated you, would you make the same choice? Leave your answer in the comments now. I'll read them all and respond personally. And if this story of revenge and justice moved you as much as it moved me, click the subscribe button now and turn on the notification bell, because every week I bring you real stories of people who turned injustice into epic triumphs, stories that prove that life can be more incredible than any movie. Don't miss the next story that could completely change your perspective on revenge, justice, and the power of perseverance. Subscribe now and join this community of people who believe that integrity always wins in the end.